Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the massive, complex, and honestly, pretty turbulent history of the United States. We're going to trace the grand narrative of this land, viewing it not just as a static timeline of dates and facts, but as a dramatic, ongoing experiment. We'll journey all the way from its earliest inhabitants through centuries of conflict, expansion, and profound transformation right up to the modern era.
We're going to map out this journey through 6 distinct eras: indigenous origins and colonization, revolution and early republic, Civil War and Reconstruction, modern America and wars, the Cold War era, and finally the contemporary United States. Let's jump right in.
All right, Section 1, Indigenous Origins and Colonization. This covers the era preceding 1754.
So, 575. That's the number of federally recognized tribes in the U.S. today. But, long before European ships ever crossed the Atlantic, this continent was already home to incredibly complex, diverse, and thriving indigenous societies spanning tens of thousands of years. This land had a deep history long before it had a modern name, complete with extensive trade networks, sophisticated agriculture, and incredibly rich cultural traditions.
Now, that deep-rooted history experienced a sudden, permanent collision with the arrival of Europeans. We see Jamestown established in 1607, and barely over a decade later in 1620, the Mayflower lands at Plymouth. In a historical blink of an eye, the entire trajectory of the continent shifted forever as these two very different worlds collided.
And building those original 13 colonies, well, it came at an immense human cost. Indigenous societies faced severe decimation through disease and war. At the exact same time, the southern colonies built an economic engine that was entirely dependent on the forced labor of millions of enslaved Africans. It is absolutely crucial to understand that these dual tragedies are the foundational economics that fueled early American expansion. It's a dark reality literally woven into the fabric of the colonial system right from its inception.
Moving on to Section 2, Revolution and the Early Republic, spanning 1754 to 1830. It's wild how fast colonial frustrations boiled over here. After the French and Indian Wars, Parliament really clamped down on self-governance. The Intolerable Acts of 1773 pretty much lit the fuse, and by 1775, shots were firing at Lexington and Concord. This was no longer just a political disagreement, right? It was a full-blown war for sovereignty. Led by George Washington's Continental Army, this fierce struggle eventually secured independence and birthed the U.S. Constitution in 1787, the literal blueprint for the modern U.S. government.
Okay, here's a surprising piece of historical trivia for you regarding 1776. We all associate the birth of the nation with the 4th of July, right? Well, actually, the Continental Congress voted to create the new nation on July 2nd with the Lee Resolution. The 4th was just the day they formally issued the paperwork for the Declaration of Independence. So, arguably, we've been setting off fireworks on the wrong day this entire time.
Which brings us to Section 3, Civil War and Reconstruction, covering 1848 to 1877. This is an era where the young republic nearly tore itself completely apart.
The root of this massive fracture was essentially a tale of two completely different economies. Up in the north, you had booming industrialization, rapidly growing cities and factory labor. Down in the south, a sprawling agricultural system, deeply entrenched in and entirely reliant upon slave labor. So this wasn't just a cultural divide. It was a fundamental incompatibility that made conflict practically unavoidable as the nation aggressively expanded westward.
The ensuing Civil War just devastated the nation from 1849 until 1865. But, stopping the fighting was only step one. The formal Reconstruction era, which was this monumental task of literally and legally rebuilding a fractured society, lasted until 1877. Actually, historians often talk about a greater Reconstruction lasting from 1846 all the way out to 1898. The country struggled for decades to figure out what a post-slavery America actually looked like in practice, completely reshaping its societal structure.
Let's jump to Section 4, Modern America and Wars, 1914 to 1945.
The first half of the 20th century was, for lack of a better term, an era of absolute historical whiplash. The U.S. enters World War I in 1917, emerges victorious, and rides this euphoric economic high straight through the roaring 20s. But then, poof, that prosperity evaporates almost overnight with the 1929 stock market crash. You have an entire generation defined by the grueling Great Depression, only to be pulled out of it by the dark clouds and immense industrial mobilization of World War II in 1941.
To survive that existential economic threat of the 1930s following the crash,
FDR's administration unleashed the New Deal. And this wasn't just a basic set of policies. It fundamentally rewrote the social contract. It totally changed how the American public expects the federal government to step in during a crisis, setting up safety nets and massive nationwide infrastructure projects. In fact, it's a dynamic and a debate about government reach that we are still actively having in politics today.
Next up is Section 5, the Cold War Era, 1945 to 1991.
Now, this era is a fascinating paradox. On the global stage, the U.S. is locked in this tense, unified standoff against communism, which fuels a massive post-World War II economic boom and, of course, the space race. But domestically, the country is undergoing massive, often really painful transformations. The Civil Rights era from 1954 to 1968 brought long overdue social reforms, fighting systemic inequality right in the midst of intense unrest. Simultaneously, you have the Vietnam War, deeply dividing generations, which eventually culminates in the conservative pivot of the Reagan era and the ultimate fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Contemporary United States, spanning from 1991 straight through to the present day.
In this modern era, the executive branch has had to navigate a rapidly shifting domestic and foreign landscape. We go from George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in the 90s to George W. Bush and Barack Obama in the new millennium, followed by the first Donald Trump administration, Joe Biden, and moving into the second Trump administration. It's just a vivid illustration of a deeply dynamic political system that is constantly reacting to new global realities, economic challenges, and shifting domestic priorities.
When we look at the timeline over these last 3 decades, we can see a distinct shift in the national focus. The optimistic post-Cold War globalization of the 1990s was completely shattered in 2001, triggering a 2-decade-long global war on terror that totally reshaped foreign policy. But then, by 2016, the pendulum swings again, bringing us into a modern political era that is intensely focused inward on domestic, cultural, and economic issues. After tracing thousands of years, from ancient indigenous societies through colonization, revolution, depression, and the rise of global superpowers, one thing is absolutely crystal clear. The only constant in United States history is unstoppable evolution. This is a nation that constantly breaks and remakes itself. So I'll leave you with this. Based on these deep-rooted cycles of expansion, conflict, and reform, what do you think the next chapter of American history will look like? Thanks so much for joining me on this Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.